I was never really a fan of the artwork for the final Beatles single, Now and Then. It looks a bit bland, doesn't it? However, turn it over, and on the back is this really interesting clock. Amazingly, this clock has a fascinating connection with George Harrison and the Beatles. So, what is the story here? Welcome back to Music Mongoose. If you love delving into music history like I do, then click subscribe and join the pack. First, let's rewind. How did Now and Then come about in the first place? Its roots go way back to around 1977 when John Lennon committed a 5-minute demo of the song onto tape at his piano in his home in the Dakota Building, New York. While the bulk of the track was there, it remained ultimately unfinished. Fast forward now to the mid-90s, the remaining Beatles reunited in an effort to finish a number of previously recorded demos by John Lennon, in an attempt to promote the upcoming Beatles anthology project. Now, the anthology project began as early as 1989, and by 1994, the remaining Beatles wanted to do something new, something musical, but felt uneasy about it because of the loss of John Lennon. They approached Yoko Ono to ask if there were any unheard John Lennon tapes that she might be in possession of. As it turns out, she was, and in January 1994, these tapes reached Paul McCartney. This moment happened at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in New York, where McCartney had just inducted Lennon. During his speech, he fondly recalled Lennon's last days, mentioning how John had told him about baking bread and playing with his son Sean. Afterward, Ono approached McCartney and handed him 2 cassettes. Though the songs on the cassettes had been bootlegged before, McCartney and the majority of Beatles fans never heard them. There were 4 demos in total: Real Love, Free as a Bird, Grow Old With Me, and Now and Then. Grow Old With Me had already been released in the 1984 album Milk and Honey, although Ringo Starr would eventually re-record this track himself. In the winter of 1994, 4 men gathered in McCartney's studio to turn these tapes into Beatles singles. In McCartney's rural hideout in southern England, a converted windmill overlooking Sussex's rolling hills, the group recorded new parts for Free as a Bird and Real Love, all agreeing to imagine that Lennon was simply out of town for the weekend. Jeff Lynne was brought on board to co-produce the project. And Paul McCartney had reservations about Jeff Lynne. Everyone's first choice, of course, to produce these singles was George Martin, but George declined the offer because of hearing issues he was experiencing. Jeff Lynne was Harrison's pick, having produced Harrison's 1989 Cloud 9 and worked with him in the Travelling Wilburys. McCartney was wary of Lynne's signature production style, polished arrangements, echoing snares, and layers of acoustic guitar. But they went with him, perhaps as a gesture of goodwill from McCartney to Harrison. And in the end, McCartney did admit that Jeff Lynne was precise. McCartney's relationship with Harrison had always been difficult, and in the studio they clashed over the final 2 lines of lyrics for Free as a Bird, and whether Harrison should play his solo with a slide guitar. Now, from the off, McCartney seemed uneasy about the whole process of recording these singles. He wasn't convinced that remaking Real Love was necessary. To him, the John Lennon demo was already complete. He told an interviewer it felt like boiling your cabbages twice, which apparently is a saying in Liverpool. Both Lennon's legacy and the potential for criticism weighed on his mind. In the end, he decided to simply dismiss the critics altogether. So to preserve his sanity, he decided to set aside the inevitable speculation about Lennon. After turning down countless reunion offers over the past 15 years, McCartney justified this project to reporters by saying, "Because John's voice is there. We can really say it is the Beatles. We're all together. We've done the impossible. We've pulled it off." Free as a Bird and Real Love were recorded and released in 1995 and 1996, respectively. Of course, Now and Then was among the demos that the Beatles tried to re-record, but they were limited with the technology at the time. In March 1995, the 3 surviving Beatles started working on the song by laying down a rough backing track intended for overdubs. This track featured acoustic guitars from both McCartney and Harrison, a basic drum track from Ringo Starr, Harrison on electric guitar, and McCartney adding bass along with a few synth things. However, work on the song eventually came to a halt, and the entire project was shelved. John Lennon's demo of Now and Then unfortunately had a few technical issues. The piano, for example, was far too loud, and John Lennon's vocals were lost. Like the song Real Love, the Now and Then demo also contained a 60Hz mains hum, but it was much louder on Now and Then, making it significantly harder to remove. And the project was mostly shelved because of Harrison's disliking of the song, largely because of its poor recording quality. George Harrison famously called the recording rubbish, while Ringo said John's vocals were lost. In a 1997 interview with Q magazine, McCartney explained George didn't like it. The Beatles being a democracy, we didn't do it. So it was shelved. However, Paul always wanted to finish it at some point. And it wasn't until around 3 decades later that the technology finally allowed them to finish Now and Then. When Peter Jackson made the documentary Get Back, he developed a piece of software called MAL, which stands for Machine Assisted Learning, and also pays tribute to former Beatles roadie Mal Evans. Using this software, the Beatles were able to clean up John Lennon's vocals and finally finish the song. In a documentary about the song, Peter Jackson explains, "While working on Get Back, we focused heavily on technical restoration, which led us to create a technology that allows us to take any audio track and separate its individual components. In May 2022, a string arrangement for Now and Then was recorded at Capitol Studios in Los Angeles. The session musicians involved had no idea this was a Beatles project. They thought they were working on a Paul McCartney project. Although George Harrison, who passed away in 2001, couldn't contribute to the new recordings of Now and Then, some of his guitar work from the earlier unfinished sessions remains on the track. Harrison can be heard playing both electric and acoustic guitar. In the documentary Now and Then, the Last Beatles Song, Paul McCartney revealed that he recorded the slide guitar part for the song, intentionally trying to replicate Harrison's distinctive style, as a tribute to George. As a result, George Harrison's presence is felt throughout the single. And this neatly brings us back to George Harrison and the clock. Shortly after the release of Now and Then, George Harrison's widow, Olivia, shared an interesting video to George Harrison's official socials.
We were in this store. George saw this clock made out of bits and pieces, and it had some Scrabble letters, and it just said Now and Then. He was attracted to it for some reason, just took it off the wall and bought it. Built this little Russian dacha in the garden and hung the clock in it, and there it sat for 25 years.
So 25-ish years before Now and Then would finally be finished, George Harrison found this clock and felt a special connection to it. The clock itself was created by an artist named Chris Giffin, who is now retired. In 1997, some of her clocks were for sale in Providence, Rhode Island. That same year, George and Olivia Harrison were in Providence because their son was attending Brown University. While there, George bought a clock that featured the words Now and Then, along with a few other pieces by Giffin. So this was only a few years after the Beatles had initially tried to record Now and Then. Whether or not that's the reason he bought the clock, we'll never know. But it's nice to think he bought it in some kind of tribute to John Lennon. In 1997, Chris Giffin received a phone call from the shop owner or the gallery owner to inform her that George Harrison had just bought a bunch of her stuff. Chris was ecstatic and honoured that a former Beatle would buy her artwork, especially George Harrison, as she felt a special connection to his beliefs and philosophy on life. Fast forward around 25 years, Giffin received an email from a representative of Apple Records informing her that they wished to use the clock as an image for the new single artwork. Now, initially, she thought it was a hoax, but eventually she agreed to sign an NDA, and there it was, her clock on the back of the Now and Then single. One thing to note, the photo at the bottom of the clock was originally a vintage photo of a city. Chris agreed to have it swapped out with the photo of the Beatles. Now, let's get back to Olivia and the clock. This is where things start to get a bit spooky. At the end of the summer in 2022, Olivia, for some reason, felt compelled to retrieve the clock from the garden and clean it up, and then display it on the mantelpiece.
End of last summer, cleaned it up a little bit, put it on the mantelpiece. Phone rings. It's Paul. And he begins to explain that there was reminding me of this third song that was on the cassette tape with Real Love and Free as a Bird. And I said, I remember it. It's called Now and Then. And I was standing there looking at the clock that said now and then. We were so moved and happy that this thing that George had held in his hand somehow magically appeared. And I said, I think this is Georgie saying it's okay.
Could this have been George, spiritually willing Olivia on to fetch that clock from the garden, clean it up and display it on the mantelpiece, as a sign to say he approved of the new single? Whether you believe in all that stuff or not, I think it's a really lovely sentiment. Now, remember those demos I mentioned earlier that Yoko Ono passed on to Paul McCartney? Well, it turns out in those demos, John Lennon had left a secret message for Ringo Starr, a message so powerful it brought Ringo to tears. You can click over here to watch the full video on that.